Picture this: Renaissance Rome, a city draped in marble splendor where the Vatican's shadow stretched over every street and every soul. Behind the glow of candlelit altars and the echo of sacred hymns, whispers told of a pope unlike any before, one who blurred the line between holy office and earthly desire. In this story, you will walk the corridors of power where sin and politics intertwined, where Rome's most powerful families were drawn into forbidden rituals that shocked even a city already steeped in decadence. What unfolded here was not prayer but feasts of excess, orchestrated by Pope Alexander VI himself, the man history remembers as both head of Christendom and the architect of scandal. If you enjoy uncovering history's darkest truths, subscribe to Secret Historians. Like this video, share your thoughts, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because stories like this connect us across centuries. What you're about to hear is not just history. It's a descent into the hidden chambers of the Vatican, where power and desire ruled side by side. Imagine a pope who, instead of prayer, orchestrated forbidden feasts where Rome's most powerful families surrendered to indulgence. The cobbled streets of Renaissance Rome echoed with the clatter of horse hooves and the chatter of merchants. From the bustling Campo dei Fiori to the shadowed alleys around the Tiber, the city was alive with trade, intrigue, and whispers. The Vatican loomed above it all, its marble halls bathed in candlelight, its altars heavy with incense. To the faithful, it was the sacred heart of Christendom. But to those who dared to whisper in private, it was also the stage for one of history's most infamous scandals. Rodrigo Borgia, crowned Pope Alexander VI in 1492, embodied contradiction. As vicar of Christ, he was the spiritual shepherd of millions. Yet as a man, he was entangled in lust, ambition, and an insatiable hunger for spectacle. His papacy unfolded not only in sermons and councils, but also in the shadows of banquet halls, where sacred vows dissolved into indulgence and the lines between sin and sacrament blurred. When Rodrigo Borgia ascended to the papal throne, the world expected politics, perhaps corruption, certainly ambition. These were not new in Rome. But what emerged shocked even a city accustomed to excess. Behind the closed doors of the Vatican, Alexander VI presided not over holy rituals, but over feasts so decadent that chroniclers struggled to find words to describe them. Imagine being summoned to one of these gatherings. The marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace are lined with torchlight. Frescoes of saints gaze down, their painted eyes watching in eternal disapproval. Yet the sound that greets you is not solemn chant, but the rise of laughter, the clink of goblets, the swelling of music. You step into a vast hall where the Pope himself reclines, robed in silk, his golden rings gleaming as he raises a cup to his lips. Around him, noblemen and women from Rome's most powerful families gather, their expressions a blend of awe and unease. The feasts began as banquets, but they never ended that way. Wine flowed like rivers, food piled high upon gilded platters, exotic dishes, peacocks with feathers still shimmering, whole roasted boars stuffed with fruits, pastries shaped into obscene forms, were paraded before the guests. As the night deepened, inhibitions dissolved. Musicians played faster, dancers moved bolder, and the Pope himself urged his guests toward abandon. And here you must pause and wonder, how could the spiritual leader of Christendom turn the Vatican into a stage for such indulgence? What does it mean when the man who should embody purity instead orchestrates vice? Among the most infamous of these events was the Banquet of Chestnuts, a night whispered about for centuries. Chroniclers, particularly Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, claimed that 50 courtesans were brought into the Vatican chambers. They danced before the Pope and his guests, shedding garments as the torches flickered until the marble floor was littered with silks and shadows. The night, Burchard wrote, descended into a contest of excess, prizes awarded for the most couplings, overseen not by priests, but by the pontiff himself. Even if exaggerated, the story struck deep. For in Rome, perception was as powerful as truth. The idea that the Pope, successor of St. Peter, could preside over such a spectacle turned whispers into outrage. To some, it was evidence of corruption so profound that only God's wrath could cleanse it. To others, it was proof of Alexander's genius for power. He controlled not only Rome's politics, but its very morality, bending both to his will. Now place yourself among those guests. You sit at the edge of the banquet, a goblet trembling in your hand, your eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding before you. Do you participate, knowing refusal could mean political ruin? Do you avert your gaze, praying silently for forgiveness while pretending to smile? Or do you watch in horrified fascination, realizing you are witnessing a chapter of history so dark it will echo for centuries? Alexander VI understood Rome in a way few did. He knew that fear and desire were twin instruments of control. By drawing the city's most powerful families into his feasts, he ensnared them. Participation bound them to him. Silence ensured their complicity. Once you had dined at the Pope's table, once you had been seen in the torchlight of his revels, you could not condemn him without condemning yourself. This was more than indulgence, it was strategy. The Borgia family thrived on such strategy. Alexander's children, Cesare, the ruthless commander, and Lucrezia, whose beauty and rumored affairs filled every whisper, were central to his reign. Some claimed Lucrezia herself appeared at these feasts, a pawn in her father's game of alliances. Whether truth or slander, the rumors were enough. For in Renaissance Rome, rumor carried the weight of scripture. And yet not all voices were whispers. Some cried openly that the Vatican had become Babylon reborn. Preachers warned that God's fury would strike Rome for its sins. But the Pope laughed, raising his cup higher as if daring heaven itself to intervene. Think of the tension in the city. On one hand, the faithful filled churches kneeling in prayer, confessing sins, believing in salvation. On the other, their shepherd reveled in pleasures that mocked the very sacraments he was sworn to uphold. The contradiction was staggering, and yet Rome endured it, as if mesmerized by the audacity of its own corruption. And you, had you lived then, would you have spoken out, risking excommunication, exile, even death, or would you have bowed your head, accepting that survival in Rome meant silence in the face of scandal? The Banquet of Chestnuts, whether wholly true or partly myth, symbolizes Alexander VI's reign. It was a reign where politics and pleasure were inseparable, where power was displayed not only in councils and treaties, but in feasts that tested the limits of morality. The Vatican's marble walls absorbed it all, the prayers of the devout and the laughter of the damned. But even as Alexander basked in his indulgence, shadows lengthened. Whispers of reform began to rise, voices that would not be silenced forever. Rome's decadence would fuel not only scandal but revolution. And the Pope's feasts, however glorious in the moment, planted seeds that would grow into storms. That night, as the torches dimmed and the music faltered, the Vatican halls held their breath. Guests stumbled out into the Roman dawn, their clothes disheveled, their secrets clinging like shadows. The marble floor still smelled of wine, the echoes of laughter lingering like ghosts, and deep within the palace, Pope Alexander VI reclined upon his couch, smiling as though he held the world in his hands. But power built on excess is fragile, and soon the same walls that echoed with laughter would tremble with cries for change. Rome in the late 15th century was a city caught between holiness and hunger, splendor and scandal. By day, pilgrims filled the streets, climbing the steps of basilicas, murmuring prayers at the tombs of saints. By night, whispers spread through taverns and palaces of the Pope whose reign blurred the sacred and the profane. To understand Alexander VI, one must see him not only as a man of excess but as a strategist who wielded desire as a weapon. The Borgia name itself was infamous long before Rodrigo claimed the papal throne. Born in Spain, he had come to Rome with ambition burning in his veins. Nephew of Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo learned early how power was negotiated within the Vatican, not with prayer alone, but with coin, charm, and calculation. By the time he donned the papal tiara, he was already father to several children, a scandal in itself, but one he transformed into advantage. His family was not ashamed to be hidden. They were pawns and players in his grand design. At his side stood Cesare Borgia, ruthless, brilliant, the very image of ambition without restraint. Historians would later see in Cesare the blueprint for Machiavelli's The Prince, a man who believed power was best secured by fear. Then there was Lucrezia, whose beauty became legend and whose name was forever tangled in whispers of scandal. Whether victim or conspirator, she was thrust into the role her father chose, a daughter whose marriages were tools of alliance, whose presence at court stirred both admiration and suspicion. But if family was weapon, feasts were theater. Alexander VI understood the psychology of Rome's nobility. They were men and women of pride, bound by lineage, eager for influence. To control them, he did not need armies, he needed indulgence. By drawing them into his banquets, by placing goblets in their hands and shadows at their backs, he ensnared them. They could not condemn what they had tasted. Their complicity was his power. Imagine the scene. A nobleman of Florence, wealthy, proud, his house adorned with saints and frescoes. He enters the Vatican hall drawn by the Pope's invitation. He expects negotiation, perhaps alliance, but instead finds torches blazing, music swelling, tables laden with impossible riches. He hesitates, uncertain, but already he is trapped. For to refuse is insult, and to participate is surrender. As the night unfolds, he drinks, he laughs, he joins in the rituals. By dawn, he is bound not by treaty, but by silence. And here you must pause. How many of history's great decisions, treaties and betrayals were sealed not in council chambers, but in torchlit feasts where reason drowned in wine? The Banquet of Chestnuts is the most infamous of all, but it was not unique. Chroniclers record many such nights, each blurring the line further. One night, dancers appeared dressed as nymphs, their movements choreographed to mimic divine myths until myth dissolved into flesh. Another night, contests of indulgence were staged, where nobles competed not for honor but for the Pope's amusement. Each event was a spectacle, a reminder that Rome's holy city was also the world's greatest theater. The Vatican's marble halls bore silent witness. Frescoes of saints stared down, their painted eyes condemning yet powerless. Priests who should have been guardians of the sacred became servants of indulgence, lighting torches, pouring wine, averting their eyes. Some chroniclers write that Alexander himself relished this juxtaposition, laughing as sacred spaces hosted profane revels. To him it was proof of dominance. He was not only pope, but master of the sacred itself, and you, if you had stood in those halls, would you have joined the laughter? Or would you have felt the weight of sacrilege pressing against your soul? Would you have dared to speak, or would silence have been your shield? Not all remained silent. Preachers rose in fury, their sermons echoing through Rome's streets. One Dominican friar, Girolamo Savonarola of Florence, thundered that corruption would bring ruin, that God's wrath would consume the city of sin. His words stirred hearts but also drew enemies. The Borgias, unshaken, dismissed him as fanatic, his voice drowned by the clink of goblets and the rustle of silk. Yet seeds of reform had been planted, and Alexander's reign would water them with scandal. The Borgia orgies, as they came to be called, became more than private spectacles. They were symbols. They symbolized a papacy that no longer merely tolerated sin but embraced it, paraded it, weaponized it. The image of 50 courtesans crawling among chestnuts on the floor, competing for the Pope's prizes, burned itself into Europe's imagination. Whether fully true or partly rumor, it did not matter. Perception was power, and Alexander had lost control of it. Still, within Rome, power remained firmly in his grasp. He held the keys to salvation, the authority to excommunicate, the purse of the Vatican. Kings and princes courted him, seeking alliances, for even scandal could not erase the power of his office. And so the feasts continued. The laughter echoed, the silks shimmered. Rome endured, trapped in fascination and fear, yet whispers grew sharper. Behind laughter lurked resentment, behind indulgence, anger. Nobles who once reveled in his halls began to grumble in private. Priests who lit torches muttered prayers for deliverance. The people, who saw extravagance while they struggled with hunger, began to curse his name. The very feasts that secured his power also sowed its undoing. And you, watching history unfold, must ask, did Alexander VI believe himself untouchable, or did he simply not care? Did he see the storm gathering, or did the wine and laughter blind him to its approach? The night of the Banquet of Chestnuts did not end with dawn. Its memory lingered, whispered in taverns, chronicled by enemies, seized upon by reformers. It became legend, scandal, prophecy. For in every torchlit hall where indulgence reigned, there was also a shadow waiting, a shadow that would one day rise as fury, not laughter. As Alexander reclined upon his couch smiling at the revels, he believed himself master of Rome. But beyond the marble walls voices gathered, storms brewed, and a world hungry for reform sharpened its gaze upon the Vatican. The Pope's laughter still echoed, but soon that laughter would be drowned by cries for change. The Vatican in Alexander VI's time was a paradox of magnificence and moral rot. Marble corridors glittered with candlelight. Frescoes by master artists filled ceilings with visions of heaven, and sacred choirs echoed hymns of devotion. Yet behind those same walls, the echoes of music were joined by laughter too bold, feasts too extravagant, and secrets too dangerous to remain confined. Rome itself seemed to vibrate with contradiction, the city of saints by day and the city of scandal by night. Rodrigo Borgia's papacy was not only about feasts, it was about power. The Borgia orgies, infamous though they were, served a deeper purpose. They cemented alliances, ensnared rivals, and made participation indistinguishable from complicity. Nobles who indulged could not later condemn. Princes who attended could not later claim innocence. The more Alexander drew them in, the more they belonged to him. But indulgence carries a price. Whispers grew sharper, and not only from monks and moralists. Ordinary citizens began to wonder whether their tithes and offerings fed the poor or lined the banquet tables of the Pope. Merchants cursed rising taxes, artisans complained of corruption, peasants muttered about famine. When faith begins to feel like theft, belief curdles into resentment. Imagine standing in the crowded market of Campo de' Fiori. Vendors shout over one another. The smell of spices and roasted meat fills the air. Yet every conversation dips into the same dangerous question. What is the Pope doing with Rome's soul? You glance over your shoulder before you speak because words have weight and spies lurk. But the question lingers, carried in low voices across the city. How long can this continue? The Pope himself seemed unconcerned. Surrounded by his children, his courtiers, his favorites, Alexander reveled in his dual identity as both father and pontiff. Cesare Borgia carved a path of blood through Italy, enforcing the family's dominance with merciless precision. Lucrezia's marriages were arranged and rearranged, alliances forged and broken, her name entwined with every whisper of scandal. The family became inseparable from the papacy itself, as though the throne of St. Peter had become merely a seat for the Borgia's dynasty. And here lies the danger. When spiritual authority is consumed by family ambition, faith itself trembles. Did Alexander believe the church was his to bend, or did he see himself as a man above it, a god of his own making? The answer depends on whom you ask, but all who lived under his reign felt the weight of the question. The feasts continued. Accounts describe torches blazing in marble halls, dancers veiled in silk, music swelling as the night grew darker. Goblets overflowed, dishes laden with delicacies sparkled under golden light. Yet these were not simply parties, they were performances of dominance. Alexander presided like a maestro, conducting not only music but desire, fear, and loyalty. Each laugh he provoked, each silence he demanded, was another thread woven into his tapestry of control. But whispers of reform traveled faster than silks could be draped or goblets refilled. North of the Alps, voices rose in protest. Preachers thundered against Rome's corruption. Pamphlets circulated with venomous words and seeds of revolution rooted in the soil of discontent. Luther's hammer had not yet struck, but the wood of the door was already dry, awaiting the spark. And you, if you had lived in Rome then, would you have dared to hope for change? Or would you have believed the Pope too powerful, the Vatican too impregnable, the world too accustomed to indulgence to ever turn? The Banquet of Chestnuts remained the most infamous symbol, but it was not an isolated night. Even without courtesans crawling among chestnuts, the spirit of indulgence lingered. Servants whispered of nights where alliances were sealed not with parchment, but with flesh, where politics dissolved into decadence. Every fresco of a saint became an unblinking witness, every marble column a silent guard to secrets never meant for daylight. Some chroniclers, hostile to the Borgias, painted the scenes darker still. They claimed Alexander's lust extended even to blasphemy, that sacred spaces became stages for sin, that holy vestments were mocked in rituals of desire. Whether truth or exaggeration, the effect was the same. The image of a pope who had betrayed his office, turning Christendom's holiest city into a carnival of corruption. Imagine kneeling in a church, confessing your sins, seeking absolution. And as you lift your head, you wonder, what sins must the Pope confess? Who hears his absolution when he himself presides over Rome's darkest nights? The question alone was dangerous, yet it echoed in countless hearts. Power built on scandal is fragile, but Alexander seemed blind to fragility. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by wealth, by family, by office. He dared his enemies to speak, and when they did, he crushed them with excommunication or sword. Yet power built on fear cannot endure forever. Every feast, every rumor, every indulgence became another crack in the foundation of his reign. And still, he laughed. Still, he raised his goblet high. Still, he invited nobles and courtiers to revel in his shadow. But Rome was listening. Rome was watching. Rome was waiting. And soon, Rome would no longer be silent. The Vatican's splendor did not dim under Pope Alexander VI. If anything, it grew brighter. Gold leaf shimmered on frescoes, marble gleamed beneath the hands of artisans, and the courts of Europe marveled at the wealth Rome commanded. Yet beneath this brilliance, shadows deepened. For every fresco painted, a whisper of corruption spread. For every hymn sung, a rumor of sin echoed. The contradiction became the heartbeat of Rome, holiness on its altars, indulgence in its chambers. Alexander wielded his position with masterful cunning. He knew the levers of power, and he pulled them with both hands. Appointments to church offices were sold like commodities. Bishops and cardinals purchased their positions, filling the coffers of the papacy while binding themselves in obligation to the Borgia cause. Every coin exchange carried not only wealth but silence. Those who entered by bribe could not question the Pope's excess without exposing their own. This strategy extended into alliances. Alexander placed his children like chess pieces across Italy. Cesare, ruthless and brilliant, carved territories through fear and war, his crimson cloak trailing in blood. Lucrezia, though barely more than a girl, was married into noble houses, her beauty and charm turning her into both ornament and weapon. Each union was less about love than leverage, less about family than empire. And you, if your daughter had been summoned into such a marriage, would you have seen fortune or doom? Would you have dared to refuse the Pope, knowing refusal meant ruin? The Vatican feasts mirrored these politics. They were not only spectacles of lust, but negotiations hidden beneath the veil of indulgence. Nobles who attended found themselves drawn deeper into the Pope's orbit. To drink his wine was to drink his power. To laugh at his jokes was to bend to his rule. Silence at his revels became complicity in his reign. Accounts of the Banquet of Chestnuts, though infamous, were only the tip of a deeper truth. Rome's morality had become currency. Chroniclers described torchlit chambers where music and laughter mingled with whispers of political bargains. Dancers twirled in silk veils while behind them treaties were negotiated, marriages arranged, alliances forged. What looked like decadence was in truth diplomacy, corruption gilded in performance. Yet the scandal spread faster than the politics. Beyond Rome, the Borgia name became synonymous with sin. Pamphlets accused Alexander of turning the papacy into a brothel, his children into conspirators, his feasts into orgies. Some of these stories were exaggerated, some perhaps invented, but truth no longer mattered. Perception was reality, and reality branded him as the most corrupt pope in history. Imagine being a pilgrim traveling from Germany, arriving in Rome with awe in your heart. You climb the steps of St. Peter's, kneel in prayer, feel the grandeur of the city. But in taverns and marketplaces you hear the whispers of feasts, of courtesans, of the Pope's children paraded like nobility. How would your faith endure such contradiction? Would you dismiss the rumors as envy? Or would you wonder if salvation itself had been tainted? This was the danger Alexander could not escape. His power within Rome was secure, but his reputation beyond its walls was bleeding. Princes eyed him with suspicion, reformers sharpened their words, and preachers thundered against his name. The Vatican, once untouchable, had become vulnerable, and still the feasts continued. Torches blazed in marble halls, goblets spilled wine across gilded tables, dancers moved with abandon. The Pope reclined upon his couch, smiling, secure in his belief that fear and desire would bind Rome forever. He did not see, or perhaps refused to see, that the same indulgence which enthralled his court was fueling a storm beyond his reach. Rome itself began to fracture. Ordinary citizens grew restless. Hunger gnawed at their bellies while the Vatican feasted. Taxes rose to fund wars and luxuries, squeezing merchants and farmers alike. Priests who should have preached salvation muttered instead of coin. Faith, once the glue of the city, cracked under the strain of excess. And you, had you lived among them, would you have dared to raise your voice? Or would you, like so many, have bowed your head, clinging to survival while the city drowned in contradictions? The Pope's enemies grew bolder. Whispers turned into pamphlets, pamphlets into sermons, sermons into movements. Reform no longer lingered at the edges. It pressed at the gates. Europe was listening, and Europe was angry. The stage was being set for a clash not of armies alone, but of ideas, of faith itself. And yet, within the Vatican, Alexander laughed. His children thrived, his alliances held, his banquets sparkled. To him the world was his theater, and he its master of ceremonies. But outside, the audience was preparing to rebel. The marble walls of Rome had absorbed laughter and song, but soon they would tremble with cries for judgment. The same corridors that had echoed with feasts would echo with fear. The Pope's indulgence, once his weapon, was becoming his curse. The torches still burned. The goblets still spilled. But the shadows were lengthening, and in those shadows revolution stirred. Rome's air grew heavier with every passing season of Alexander VI's reign. The grandeur of the Vatican dazzled visitors with its painted ceilings and marble corridors, but beneath the shine lay a city straining under corruption and fear. To many outside its walls, Rome no longer represented the eternal city of saints. It had become the stage for the ambitions of a single family, the Borgias. Alexander's greatest weapon remained his ability to entangle others in his excess. To dine at his table, to laugh at his feasts, to drink from his goblets was to bind oneself to him. The nobles of Rome understood this all too well. They whispered in their villas, cursed in private, yet returned when summoned, for absence meant exclusion, and exclusion meant danger. The Vatican was not merely a palace, it was a snare. The Pope's children deepened that snare. Cesare Borgia marched through Italy with ruthless brilliance, carving duchies and cities into a dominion of fear. His cruelty was matched only by his cunning, and he became the sword of the papacy. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was married and remarried, her beauty a bargaining chip, her name tangled in rumors of incest and betrayal. Whether innocent pawn or willing conspirator, history left her forever branded by whispers of scandal. And you, imagine being one of Rome's noble families. Your fortunes depend on papal favor. Your sons seek bishoprics, your daughters await alliances. How would you resist a pope who could strip you of everything with a word? Would you endure his feasts, swallow your pride and hope to survive his game? Or would you gamble on rebellion knowing failure meant ruin? The feasts themselves became infamous across Europe. Chroniclers, both friends and enemies, spread tales of nights where torches flickered on bare marble floors, where dancers blurred myth and flesh, where indulgence masqueraded as ritual. Some described courtesans scattering chestnuts, crawling to collect them as the Pope watched with amusement. Others claimed contests of passion were rewarded with prizes, sanctioned by the pontiff himself. Whether fully true or not, these accounts shaped the image of Alexander as a pope of decadence beyond measure. Outside Rome, outrage grew. Preachers thundered from pulpits, condemning the Vatican as Babylon reborn. In Florence, Girolamo Savonarola declared that the church had become a harlot, corrupted by greed and lust. His words ignited the faithful, but also signed his death warrant. Burned in Florence's piazza, his ashes scattered to the Arno, Savonarola became both martyr and warning. Opposition to Rome was perilous, yet necessary. But Alexander dismissed such threats with a smirk. To him, sermons were noise, pamphlets were gossip, enemies were obstacles to be crushed. He wielded excommunication like a sword, striking down princes and preachers alike. His confidence grew with every victory, his laughter echoing through marble halls as if daring heaven itself to intervene. Yet every indulgence carried a cost. Rome's coffers strained under endless festivals, banquets, and wars. Taxes rose, merchants grumbled, peasants starved. The gap between the Vatican's glittering halls and the city's hunger widened into a chasm. Faith itself trembled, for when salvation feels purchased with coin and drowned in wine, the people begin to doubt not only their pope, but their God. And you, had you been a pilgrim then, traveling weeks across Europe to kneel at St. Peter's tomb? How would you have felt to see Rome's holy shepherd mocked as a tyrant of indulgence? Would your faith survive the contradiction? Or would doubt creep in like shadow at dusk? The contradictions grew unbearable. Alexander's political maneuvers alienated allies, his family's ambition created enemies, his scandals fed reformers. Europe's princes muttered, Germany's priests whispered, and even within Rome discontent smoldered. The feasts that once enthralled now disgusted. The indulgence that once inspired awe now provoked fury. Still the Pope believed himself untouchable. He reclined in torchlit halls, goblet in hand, surrounded by dancers and courtiers. He smiled as his children's power spread, as his enemies fell, as his revels echoed louder than the prayers outside his doors. He thought his reign eternal, his name secure. But history was moving against him. Reform was no longer a whisper, it was a gathering storm. Soon the same halls that rang with laughter would echo with condemnation. The same name that commanded fear would become a symbol of corruption. The Borgia's hold on Rome was strong but not unbreakable. The Vatican torches still blazed, casting golden light across marble and silk. The Pope still raised his cup, secure in his throne. Yet beyond those walls, a world was watching, sharpening its knives, preparing to strike not with steel, but with words, with ideas, with a fury greater than any feast could silence. The laughter continued, but it trembled now as though, even within the Vatican, shadows whispered of judgment near at hand. Rome, in the waning years of the 15th century, stood at the brink of transformation. To many eyes, the eternal city gleamed with unrivaled beauty. Pilgrims marveled at the basilicas, merchants crowded the piazzas, and scholars debated under frescoed ceilings. Yet beneath the marble and music, discontent coiled like a serpent. Pope Alexander VI's reign had become a paradox of brilliance and decay. Politically shrewd, ruthlessly effective, but morally stained in ways that echoed far beyond the Vatican walls. His children had become extensions of his papacy. Cesare Borgia, once destined for the church, had cast off the robes of a cardinal to don armor. With his father's blessing, he swept across Italy, seizing territories with iron will. Cities fell to him not only through force but through terror. His name alone struck fear into nobles and peasants alike. Machiavelli, watching from Florence, would one day use Cesare as the model for ruthless power in The Prince. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was no longer a child, but a woman whose marriages were chess pieces on her father's board. She was sent to forge alliances, her beauty praised, her loyalty questioned, her every move scrutinized through the lens of scandal. And you? Had you been in Lucrezia's place, would you have accepted the role of pawn for your family's gain? Or would you have sought to turn the game to your own advantage, risking the wrath of father and brother alike? The feasts that scandalized Rome did not cease. If anything, they grew more extravagant as Alexander's political power deepened. Ambassadors recorded nights of torchlit revelry, where foreign princes and Italian dukes dined at the papal table while courtesans danced among them. Wine flowed from golden pitchers, rare dishes filled gilded platters, music swelled until dawn. To be absent was to risk offense. To attend was to risk one's soul. The Vatican became both palace and prison, dazzling yet suffocating. Every guest knew that their presence bound them. To laugh at Alexander's jokes, to raise a cup in his hall, was to align oneself with his scandal. And silence afterward ensured complicity. The Pope's greatest sin, perhaps, was not indulgence alone, but the way he turned indulgence into chains. Rumors spread that even sacred spaces were not immune. Some claimed that chapels once filled with hymns now hosted whispered negotiations during banquets, that frescoes of saints bore witness to spectacles unfit for their gaze. Others insisted that the Pope mocked rituals themselves, turning what was holy into performance. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales carried power. They painted a picture of Rome as Babylon reborn, its shepherd feasting while the flock starved. The city outside the Vatican groaned. Taxes drained merchants, soldiers demanded wages, peasants faced famine. While the Pope reclined among silks, his people endured hunger and fear. Resentment simmered in taverns and marketplaces in whispered prayers. Faith, once unshakable, began to fray. What did salvation mean when its guardian was mired in scandal? And you? Imagine being a priest in a countryside parish, collecting tithes from starving peasants, knowing that their coin funded feasts in Rome. Could you stand before your flock with conviction? Or would guilt shadow your sermons, your voice faltering as you repeated prayers that even you doubted? Reform was no longer a whisper. Across Europe, voices grew louder. Pamphlets denounced Rome's corruption. Preachers thundered that the Vatican was a house of sin. In Germany, murmurs began that would one day erupt in Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority. The spark had not yet been struck, but the tinder was dry, and Alexander's reign piled it higher with each indulgence. Yet within Rome, the Pope remained confident. His enemies fell to excommunication, his allies multiplied through marriage and coin, His armies marched under Cesare's banner. He believed his legacy secure, his dynasty unshakable. He did not see that every feast, every rumor, every scandal was weaving a rope that would one day tighten around the papacy itself. The Banquet of Chestnuts, though perhaps exaggerated by chroniclers, became the symbol of it all. 50 courtesans crawling for chestnuts in torchlight was not merely a salacious tale. It was an image that captured Europe's outrage. Even if partly myth, it spoke a truth greater than fact. The Pope had turned Christendom's heart into a theater of vice. Alexander reclined in his gilded chambers, goblet in hand, surrounded by courtiers, children, and allies. His laughter echoed down marble corridors, confident, unshaken. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by the sanctity of his office, the strength of his family, the fear he inspired. But shadows lengthened. Whispers of judgment grew louder. Reformers sharpened their words, enemies honed their knives. The eternal city, dressed in gold and incense, carried within it the weight of inevitable reckoning. And even as the Pope raised his cup higher, the question lingered like a storm on the horizon. How long could Rome endure the contradictions of holiness cloaked in sin? The answer would come sooner than Alexander imagined. The year was turning, and Rome wore the weight of Alexander II's reign like a heavy cloak. The Pope's power seemed unshakable. His children were entrenched in Italian politics, his alliances stretched across kingdoms, and his enemies had been silenced by steel or excommunication. Yet beneath the marble brilliance of the Vatican, cracks widened. The people muttered, reformers raged, and even allies began to question whether indulgence could hold an empire together. By now, Cesare Borgia's name was both feared and cursed. As captain general of the papal armies, he had carved a path of conquest through Romagna, crushing rivals with merciless efficiency. Cities fell before him. Lords who defied him met daggers in the dark. To Machiavelli, he was the perfect prince, decisive, ruthless, commanding. But to Italy's nobles, he was a wolf wearing papal blessing as armor. Everywhere Cesare went, whispers followed, that his power came not from God but from his father's corruption. Lucrezia, too, became an icon of suspicion. Though only a young woman, her marriages had bound Rome to powerful families. She was adored by some, pitied by others, and demonized by many. Rumors painted her as seductress, conspirator, even poisoner. Truth and slander blurred until they became indistinguishable, and her name was inseparable from scandal. Whether she deserved it or not, Lucrezia had become a living emblem of the Borgia legend. Beauty draped over intrigue. And you, if you had been in Lucrezia's world, would you have trusted her smile? Or would you have feared that every word she spoke carried her father's shadow? Alexander VI reveled in his family's power. He saw himself as architect of a dynasty that would endure. Every feast, every alliance, every marriage, every battle was another stone laid in the fortress of Borgia rule. But dynasties are fragile things, especially when built on fear and excess. For as much as Alexander secured his position, he multiplied his enemies. The Vatican feasts continued, but their atmosphere shifted. Once spectacles of awe, they now carried the weight of mockery. Guests attended because they had to, not because they wished to. Laughter rang hollow, eyes darted nervously, and silence afterward was no longer loyalty but survival. The very tool Alexander had used to bind his nobles had become a prison of shame. Beyond Rome, the storm intensified. In Germany, murmurs of reform gathered strength. Scholars questioned indulgences, preachers condemned papal corruption, pamphlets painted Rome as Babylon. The scandal of the Borgia papacy fed these flames. Alexander's name became not only a curse in Italy, but a rallying cry for those who dreamed of tearing the church apart. Inside Rome, famine and plague struck. Streets that once filled with pilgrims now echoed with the cries of the hungry and the sick. The contrast was unbearable. Golden halls overflowing with wine and delicacies while outside citizens starved. Every torchlit banquet in the Vatican became a provocation. The city simmered with resentment, its patience thinning. And you imagine being a pilgrim arriving at the Vatican gates. You have sold your possessions for the journey, walked weeks under hardship hoping to see holiness embodied. Instead, you find a city swollen with vice, a pope whose name drips with scandal. Would your faith survive? Or would you return home carrying only anger, whispering that Rome had betrayed Christ? Alexander, however, remained convinced of his invincibility. He dismissed critics as envious, reformers as heretics, citizens as ungrateful. He believed that the authority of his office, combined with his family's might, made him untouchable. Even when omens appeared, strange storms, fires, and rumors of poisoned wells, he laughed them off, raising his goblet higher, daring heaven itself to judge him. But heaven, some whispered, was already sharpening its sword. By the summer of 1503, tension in Rome was palpable. Cesare prepared new campaigns. Lucrezia was maneuvered into yet another marriage, and Alexander plotted alliances to secure their dominion. A great banquet was planned at the villa of Cardinal Adriano da Corneto, a celebration that promised to display once more the wealth and power of the papacy. Invitations were issued, goblets polished, delicacies prepared. It would be a night to remember, but not for the reasons the Borgias intended. As guests gathered, the air was thick with anticipation. The Pope and his son Cesare dined together, surrounded by courtiers, cardinals, and nobles. Music filled the air, torches blazed, laughter echoed. It seemed another night in the endless procession of indulgence. Yet beneath the splendor lay danger. Some whispered that poison lurked in the wine, intended for a rival cardinal. Others claimed the food itself carried death. The truth was tangled in rumor, but what followed was undeniable. Alexander VI fell violently ill. The Pope, who had laughed at reformers, who had mocked omens, who had presided over feasts of excess, now found his own body writhing in pain. Sweating, gasping, trembling, he was carried from the villa. Cesare, too, collapsed, struck by the same affliction. Rome, stunned, whispered the unthinkable. Had God struck his judgment? And you, standing in that banquet hall watching the Pope convulse, what would you have thought? That it was poison from mortal hands or vengeance from heaven? Would you have rushed to help or stepped back, fearing to be caught in divine wrath? The torches sputtered, the music died. The marble floors that had borne laughter now bore panic. Guests fled, servants whispered, and the eternal city held its breath. The most powerful Pope in memory, the man who turned Rome into his theater, lay on the edge of death. The feasts were over. The laughter was silenced, and the Vatican trembled, waiting to see if its master would rise again, or if Alexander VI would be swallowed by the very shadows he had conjured. The villa where the feast had been held fell into chaos as Pope Alexander VI collapsed. Torches flared as servants rushed forward, their faces pale with fear. The marble floor that only moments before had echoed with laughter now carried the sound of gasps and hurried footsteps. Courtiers fled into the night, whispering of poison, of divine judgment, of plots finally reaching their mark. Alexander's body was carried back to the Vatican, trembling with fever, his breath ragged. Cesare, too, writhed in agony, his once indomitable frame reduced to weakness. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. For all the city's disdain, for all the whispers of scandal, the sudden prospect of a pope's death was a crisis too vast to comprehend. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the Pope and his son had intended to poison a rival cardinal, only to drink from the wrong cup themselves. Others claimed a servant had slipped venom into the feast to avenge years of humiliation. Still others believed no mortal hand was responsible, that God himself had intervened, striking down the pontiff who had mocked heaven for too long. And you, if you had lived in that moment, hearing the bells toll in the night, what would you have believed? Poison, conspiracy, or divine wrath? Which story would you have dared to repeat, and which would you have kept locked in silence for fear of reprisal? In the Vatican, panic reigned. Physicians were summoned, prayers were muttered, relics were pressed against Alexander's fevered skin. Yet nothing could halt the sickness. His once ruddy face turned ashen, his body bloated with fever, his voice reduced to groans. The Pope, who had filled marble halls with laughter, now lay broken upon his bed, a grotesque shadow of his former self. Cesare, though suffering, fought to recover. His mind, sharpened by ambition even in illness, turned toward survival. If his father died, the world would shift overnight. Enemies long silenced would rise, rivals would seize opportunity, and the Borgia dynasty could crumble. He knew that power was fragile, and in the fevered hours of that August it hung by a thread. The city outside boiled with speculation. Crowds gathered near the Vatican, desperate for news. Pilgrims prayed at altars, some for the Pope's recovery, others for his death. Merchants muttered that perhaps justice had come at last. Priests whispered sermons of judgment. careful not to be overheard. For the first time in years, Alexander's power no longer inspired fear but invited open debate. Imagine standing in a Roman tavern that week, the air thick with smoke and rumor. At one table, a merchant swears the Pope had been struck by heaven itself. At another, a soldier insists he saw a servant slip something into the wine. Across the room, a scholar declares that Rome will never recover from the shame of Alexander's reign. And you sit among them wondering if you are witnessing the end of an era or the beginning of something far worse. On August 18, 1503, the news spread. Pope Alexander VI was dead. The man who had ruled Rome with indulgence and terror, who had transformed the papacy into a stage for family ambition and forbidden feasts, lay lifeless. His body, swollen and discolored, became itself a symbol of corruption. Chroniclers described it in grotesque detail, claiming it decayed so rapidly that even embalmers recoiled. Some said his corpse turned as black as pitch, a final judgment written upon his flesh. Whether exaggeration or truth, the image burned into Europe's imagination. Cesare, though weakened, clung to power. He tried to maneuver swiftly, to secure his territories, to ensure his family's survival. But without his father, his strength faltered. Rivals rose, allies betrayed, and the tides of Italy shifted against him. The Borgia dream of dynasty crumbled as quickly as it had risen, and yet the legacy of Alexander VI did not end with his death. In fact, it had only begun. His scandals became ammunition for reformers across Europe. Preachers pointed to his reign as proof that the papacy was corrupt beyond repair. Pamphlets depicted him as the embodiment of vice, a man who turned the Vatican into Babylon. His feasts, his children, his lusts, whether truth or rumor, became symbols of everything reformers would fight to overthrow. The seeds of the Reformation had been planted long before, but Alexander's reign watered them with scandal. When Martin Luther nailed his theses in 1517, the memory of Alexander still lingered. To question indulgences was to question the very system that had enriched men like him. To demand reform was to demand freedom from the corruption he embodied. And you, looking back now, centuries later, do you see Alexander VI as a villain, a warning, or a man trapped by his own appetite? Do you believe he was uniquely corrupt or simply the most visible face of a system already rotting? The Vatican itself struggled to erase his memory. His successors distanced themselves, painting him as an aberration rather than a symptom. His name became synonymous with scandal. His family cursed in whispers. Cesare, once feared across Italy, fell into decline, his dreams of empire collapsing. Lucretia, married into yet another noble house, faded into a quieter role, her name forever shadowed by rumor. But Alexander's story never vanished. It lingered in chronicles, in pamphlets, in sermons. His feasts became legend. His sins became cautionary tales. His death became a symbol of divine judgment. Rome survived, but it carried the scar of his reign. The eternal city had feasted and wept, laughed and groaned, indulged and repented. Yet through it all it had endured. That is the paradox of Rome. It bends but does not break, even under the weight of scandal. Still, as the torches dimmed on Alexander's funeral, and his bloated body was lowered into the earth, one question lingered like smoke over the city. Had Rome buried only a man, or had it buried the last shred of faith in the purity of its church? The marble halls stood silent. The feasts were over, but the echoes of his reign would never fade. And as Europe turned its gaze toward reform, toward rebellion, toward schism, the shadow of Alexander VI loomed as both warning and prophecy. The Pope was gone. But the storm he unleashed had only just begun. Rome had buried Pope Alexander VI, but his shadow lingered like a storm that refuses to pass. The eternal city exhaled with relief at his death, yet fear and suspicion clung to its streets. The Borgias had ruled with fire and feast, laughter and terror, and though their patriarch was gone, his memory weighed heavily on the Vatican and beyond. The funeral itself was a spectacle of contradictions. Chroniclers described the Pope's corpse as grotesque, swollen, discolored, already decaying. To the faithful, it was a divine sign, proof that corruption had not gone unanswered. To others, it was evidence of poison, a reminder that power in Rome was as fragile as it was intoxicating. Priests murmured prayers over the coffin, but many whispered that heaven itself had rendered judgment before the last bell tolled. Cesare Borgia, weakened from the same illness, tried desperately to maintain control. He plotted, schemed, and rallied his forces. Yet without his father's papal throne to shield him, his enemies closed in, allies turned cautious, rivals struck boldly, and the great dream of a Borgia dynasty crumbled like ash in his hands. Once feared as a wolf, Cesare found himself cornered, his territories stripped, his name reduced to memory. Lucrezia, too, faded into a quieter life. Married into the Este family of Ferrara, she left behind the intrigues of the Vatican. She became patron of the arts, mother to children, a duchess who ruled with grace. Yet her name never escaped the shadows of rumor. To many, she was still the woman of scandal, the daughter of indulgence, the symbol of corruption veiled in beauty. Whether guilty or victim, history refused her absolution, and you, if you had been one of Lucrezia's subjects in Ferrara, would you have trusted her rule? Or would you have always wondered if her father's sins lingered in her smile? The Vatican, eager to cleanse itself, distanced from the Borgia legacy. Successors painted Alexander VI as a singular monster, a cautionary tale rather than a symptom of broader decay. Yet Europe was not convinced. Reformers seized upon his reign as proof of a church rotted from within. Pamphlets circulated, sermons thundered, scholars sharpened their pens. The name Borgia became synonymous with vice, indulgence, corruption. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses in 1517, the shadow of Alexander still stretched across Europe. To challenge indulgences was to strike at the very practices that had funded feasts and filled papal coffers. To question papal authority was to question the legacy of a pope who had turned Rome into Babylon reborn. Though Alexander had been dead for more than a decade, his scandals remained alive, fueling the flames of Reformation. The irony is clear. Alexander sought to build a dynasty that would last forever. Instead, he built a legacy of infamy that outlived him in ways he never intended. His feasts became legend, his sins became caution, his family became myth. Even centuries later, his name evokes images of torchlit halls, courtesans crawling for chestnuts, goblets spilling wine across marble floors. History remembers not his politics, not his treaties, but his indulgence. And you, sitting here now, centuries later, what do you make of it? Was Alexander VI the most corrupt pope in history or merely the most infamous? Was he a man of extraordinary vice or simply the one whose sins were too visible to hide? Does his story reveal the fallibility of men or the fragility of institutions that place absolute power in their hands? Rome endured. It always does. The marble halls that echoed with Alexander's laughter later echoed with the prayers of his successors. The Vatican survived the scandal, survived the Reformation, survived the centuries. Yet it carried the scar of his reign, a scar carved not into stone but into memory. The Eternal City has always been a paradox, sacred and profane, holy and corrupt, eternal and fragile. Alexander VI embodied that paradox more than any who came before him. He was pope and patriarch, priest and politician, sinner and strategist. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the holiest offices are filled by men, and men are vulnerable to the same temptations that have haunted humanity since the beginning. So picture it again. The torchlit hall of the Vatican, the Pope reclining with goblet in hand, courtesans moving among nobles, laughter rising above the frescoes of saints. Behind every smile lurks fear, behind every cheer complicity. The night stretches on, indulgence reigns, and history watches. Now ask yourself, was this simply one man's corruption? Or was it the mirror of an institution already broken? Was Alexander VI an anomaly, or a prophecy of what happens when power goes unchecked? Tell us in the comments what you believe. Was Pope Alexander VI history's most corrupt pontiff, or merely the most notorious? Because some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish, keep them alive with us here at Secret Historians.